along. So it's not entirely surprising that Sally did not return Simcoe's affections. He seems to have left the United States having lost or about to lose the war to these American rebels who gained their independence, ill from the sicknesses that he'd come down with while captured and spending months in an American rebel prison before being sent home because of his illness. And on top of all those injuries and war wounds, nursing a broken heart as well. So Simcoe, toward the end of the war, headed back to England and went to his godfather's house, this big estate in Devon, a beautiful part of England called Wolford Chapel. Still there today. It's a retirement community now, where his godfather lived and where Simcoe could spend a little time nursing his wounds, both the physical ones from fighting the war and maybe the emotional ones from the rejection he suffered at Sally's hands. It was here that he probably for the first time met his godfather's niece. Her name was another one which will be familiar to people in this part of the province. She was Elizabeth Gwillimbury. Back then would become Elizabeth Simcoe because this is where they fell in love. They would spend time together at Wolford Lodge, go for long walks through the countryside together. As I say, this whole area is gorgeous, literally one of England's official areas of outstanding natural beauty, filled with these green rolling hills with a long history of tales of magic and fairies and pixies and smugglers and pirates, with deep, old, ancient roads with sunken lanes where John and Elizabeth would go for romantic walks. He with his long strides, and Elizabeth, very short, having to race to catch up to him every few strides or so to make up the difference, then head back to the house where she would write in her diary, I believe, and paint watercolors of the scenes that they'd seen that day. So it wasn't long before the young couple headed down the hill to an old church where they got married. And from there began spending their lives together. She inherited the estate next door. They built their own home in a chapel on their land, began having their own children and raising a family, and really beginning the rest of their lives together. But there was still fallout from the American Revolution that was still being experienced, even though this was years later. The Americans, of course, had won the war, and the United States became independent. But not every American, of course, had agreed with the revolutionaries and with the idea of independence. A lot of people who'd been British their whole lives wanted to stay British. And these loyalists were now suddenly seen as traitors instead of citizens, and they were no longer welcome to live in these new United States. A lot of them even faced violence, tarred and feathered, attacked in their homes, some houses burned down, some families assaulted while out on picnics, really made clear that they were no longer welcome in these United States. So that in the wake of the Revolution, there were tens of thousands of loyal British refugees who now needed to find somewhere new to live. Many of them headed north to the Canadian colonies. So many, in fact, that the British decided to create a whole new colony, pretty much specifically to be a home for these refugees, those loyalists arriving from the United States. So, the British took their colony of Quebec, which had been New France until a couple of decades earlier, when they conquered New France, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the 7 Years' War, all of that. They took Quebec and split it in half, so that the half that was already quite settled, lots of French Canadians, already had big growing cities like Quebec and Montreal and Trois-Rivières. It became Lower Canada, what's now Quebec, mostly still Francophone, and the rest of the province, the part that had yet to be settled, was still overwhelmingly home to indigenous people rather than settlers, and really only had one small city, Kingston. That became Upper Canada, a home for these loyalist refugees, and sort of the beginning of a big push of settling this indigenous land with British settlers. And the person they put in charge of this new colony, well, that was John Graves Simcoe. He had experience in North America since he fought in the war. He hated the United States since he fought against the Americans, which the British thought was a pretty useful trait to have as a guy running a Canadian colony. And he had military experience, which was important at a time when they thought the United States might invade the Canadian colonies at any time. So Simcoe, as the first governor, was going to be responsible for really beginning this push for settlement in Upper Canada, in southern Ontario. So he and Elizabeth pack up their things and head out across the ocean. Their oldest children they leave behind them here at Wolford, where they will continue going to school. Even their youngest children, a one-year-old boy, Francis, and a slightly older toddler, I think Sophia, 2 years old, and lots of their belongings and some of their servants all bundled up together on a ship that starts beginning the very, very long voyage to get to this part of the world. It took 2 months, I think, to sail across the Atlantic through all kinds of weather before finally reaching the mouth of the St. Lawrence and reaching Quebec City, which was the oldest city in that part of the Canadian colonies, but they reached it just in time for winter to arrive, which means they were stuck in Quebec City then for months on end, waiting for the ice to thaw before they finally be able to set out on the next leg of their journey up the St. Lawrence River toward Lake Ontario. And even that was an incredibly long and dangerous journey at the time. There were rapids on the St. Lawrence. They were traveling mostly by canoe. Elizabeth was also pregnant at this point with another child. There's a little story in her diary from one day when the good weather finally came to Quebec City, where she and John went for what sounds like quite a romantic moonlit stroll across the parapets at the top of the cliff in Quebec. She would have her baby Catherine almost 9 months to the day from that diary entry of that walk in Quebec City. So I have my suspicions about exactly how pregnant she was when she was heading in their canoes up the St. Lawrence, portaging when they hit rapids before finally reaching Lake Ontario and then sailing clear across the lake, now many more months removed from having left Quebec. And finally, about a year after they left their home in England, they finally arrived at their destination, which was a place that was called Newark back then, but today we call Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's the mouth of the Niagara River, with Newark, the British side of the river, here over on the left. It was a tiny, tiny little town. It didn't even have a church yet at this point, but it was the little makeshift muddy capital for this new colony of Upper Canada. And it was right in this building that you can see in the drawing that looks like little more than a hut that John Graves Simcoe would establish the government of this new colony. It's called Navy Hall. There's sort of a version of it still there today, sort of part of the Fort George historic site, I think. This is Simcoe opening the very first Parliament, which was held inside Navy Hall, this wooden log looking building in the background, where he had his first Parliament, his first government meet. As you can see, a government that clearly reflected all the diversity of the people and sort of set to work establishing this presence of the British Empire at the very edge of what to the British was really the frontier of the known world, the very edge of the British universe, even though it was a place very familiar to the First Nations who'd been living here all along. And while he was getting ready for this new super British colony, preparing his government, this is where he and his family lived. They pitched what were really two big fancy tents that they called the Canvas House, the very same tents that the famous British explorer James Cook had taken with him on his explorations of the South Pacific until, I believe, he met his end when he tried to kidnap an indigenous leader in Hawaii and was murdered in return, which meant his stuff went up on auction, which gave the Simcoes a chance to buy his canvas house for their own imperial British needs. And it was here, at Niagara, that the government of Upper Canada was run for a while, basically in sort of an ambitious, fancy tent with 2 rooms and floors that folded out. I think it even had windows as well. And it's where Simcoe and really the whole family lived during those days. So while Simcoe, John Graves Simcoe, was busy establishing the government, his wife, Elizabeth, had her own responsibilities. It was really her job to try to bring sort of upper-class British culture to this tent at the edge of the frontier. She documented the things that were happening, which is one of the main ways we remember her today. So that painting I showed you of the week Toronto was founded, that's Elizabeth Simcoe's watercolor. This painting in the background of Navy Hall in the mouth of the Niagara River, that's her work too. And many of the images I'm going to be showing you tonight are all Elizabeth Simcoe's work. And she kept a diary so that we've got a record day to day of what was happening during the founding days of Upper Canada and the founding days of Toronto too. But she was also spending a lot of time on social activities, trying to make it this very British colony. One of my favorite facts about her is that even though she had to make that year-long journey through ship, through the ice of Quebec, all the way past the rapids of the St. Lawrence and across Lake Ontario, she brought a spinning wheel with her, an enormous, ungainly spinning wheel all the way to the frontier, even though she never used it, just because it had been a gift from the Queen, so it was too symbolically important to leave at home, unlike those 2 kids that they did leave at home. Here, living in the tent on the frontier of Niagara, she held dinners and dances and balls and card parties with all the other most important settler families in Upper Canada, all trying to bring that sort of Jane Austen drawing room culture to this tent at the edge of the frontier. In fact, the Simcoes and Jane Austen knew some mutual people in common. Could be they'd even literally been to some of the same parties back home in England. They very much traveled in the same circles. She also gave birth to that daughter. This isn't her, I've stolen a painting of a Medici child, just so you know. And it's the least weird looking old swaddled baby I could find on the internet. So this is as good as it gets. This represents Catherine Simcoe, who was born there in that tent. And is also, sadly, a reminder of how dangerous life here was. The illness, in addition to other dangers, was a constant threat. Elizabeth suffered from a bout of malaria while they were living at Niagara, and Catherine would only live just past 1 year old and made it to Toronto before catching what seems to have been, based on the symptoms, probably a case of meningitis that killed her very quickly overnight. But the Simcoes, as I've hinted before, and as you all know because you know what this talk is about, didn't just have their kids with them, as I mentioned before, they also had some pets. And it was while they were living there that they really first met them. Jack Sharp had been living here at Navy Hall, or at least around it back then. He was actually the dog of the sheriff of Niagara on the Lake, Newark, back then. But he seems to have fallen in love with the Simcoe family when they arrived and started hanging out with them instead of his sheriff master, and sort of adopted the Simcoes as his own family. And he was from an old Canadian breed that the Simcoes would probably find particularly useful, because Newfoundlands had been living in what's now Canada for as long as anyone could remember. They've been on the island of Newfoundland literally as long as anyone can remember, so long that no one actually knows where they came from, how they were originally bred or evolved. There are a bunch of theories, some more common and more plausible than others. Some people like to say that they were descended from the wild wolves of Newfoundland, or maybe even from the domesticated hunting dogs of local First Nations. Some people like to say that maybe they're descendants from the big black bear dogs that the Vikings brought with them across the Atlantic 1,000 years ago, when they established at least one settlement here at Lonceau Meadows on the tip of Newfoundland. But it seems much more likely that the Newfoundlands are descended from the dogs of the first European sailors, whalers, and fishermen who crossed the ocean after the Vikings, beginning really in the early 1500s. People like the Basque whalers, who started sailing across the Atlantic and establishing sort of seasonal outposts where they would spend the warmer months before sailing back to the Basque country at the border of Spain and France during the winters. And you can still even see the evidence of these Basque whalers from the early 1500s in places like Red Bay, Labrador today, where you'll find the skulls and bones of the whales that they hunted 500 years ago, still bleaching on the beaches today. These dogs in Newfoundland actually started with breeds separate from the Newfoundlands. This would be one of the Newfoundland's ancestors, the St. John's water dog, named after the capital of Newfoundland, which was a dog that many sailors and people living on the water found very useful, and which led to the development of two famous and distinct breeds. In fact, one of the descendants of the St. John's water dog, which sadly is a breed that's gone extinct today, the last two were found in the 1970s in Newfoundland after it thought they'd all died out, but they were both males, so the breed ended with them. But their descendants are very much still with us today. It's the St. John's water dogs who eventually lead to the development of the Labrador Retriever. The shorter-coated St. John's water dogs were prized for the fact that they had shorter coats, unlike some of their cousins that got them tangled with snow every winter. So, while some British sailors took the Labrador style to Britain, where some noblemen were so impressed watching them swim through the waves that they got some of their own and created the Labrador breed, their longer-coated cousins and brothers became the Newfoundland breed, with big, thick, warm coats that are waterproof, webbed toes so that they're very strong swimmers, and brave and loyal and unafraid of leaping into the water. So that the Newfoundland has, along with their cousins, the St. Bernards, a big reputation for saving people from drowning. Though, in this image, I'll admit, it looks a little unclear whether this child has been saved from the water by the dog, or the dog has killed the kid and is guarding its prize. There are all sorts of stories of Newfoundlands saving lives. You can still find some wreckage of a shipwreck in Grossmoor National Park in Newfoundland, where a Newfoundland dog is said to have saved the entire complement of people on board by swimming out with a rope in its teeth to shore, a baby being swung to safety along that rope, and other survivors too. There was a Newfoundland who fought in Hong Kong with Canadian troops during the Second World War. He gave his life during a battle, grabbing a grenade and running away from Canadian soldiers. He would be granted his own medal that just says hero across it. There's a statue to his memory in Gander, Newfoundland, and you'll find his name on the Hong Kong Victims Memorial Wall in Ottawa, listed with all the human Canadians who died during that battle too. Newfoundlands were, because of all these characteristics, the perfect dog for British explorers who were heading deeper into the continent. So as they left the East Coast, where these dogs were already living, a lot of the most famous European explorers of all time had Newfoundland dogs at their side while they were doing it. There was a Newfoundland dog with David Thompson, the famous British-Canadian explorer, as he explored sort of northern Manitoba, helping him to fend off polar bears up there where Churchill is today. There was a Newfoundland dog called Seaman who traveled with Lewis and Clark on their expeditions across the United States. And it's said that there was even a Newfoundland dog with Alexander Mackenzie, the first European explorer to cross the entire continent, go through the Rockies and reach the far side of North America. So that now Newfoundlands had spread from one coast all the way to the other. And that helps explain why Jack Sharp at Niagara would be a perfect dog to accompany the Simcoes, now that they were living all the way out here on what to them was the frontier. In fact, when Simcoe left his family behind to do long trips through the wilderness, he would take Jack Sharp with him. The first big trip was all the way west to Fort Detroit, traveling all through the area west of here. It's the trip where John Graves Simcoe renamed the river the Thames in honor of the Thames in England, and imagined building London, Ontario. And headed all the way out there with many indigenous guides to show him the way. Joseph Brant, the famous Haudenosaunee chief, was with him, and Jack Sharp was with him too. It was winter then, so a particularly difficult and dangerous journey, and one in which Jack Sharp had no problem getting into trouble. So there's stories of Jack Sharp facing off against an angry raccoon as they traveled through the woods of Upper Canada, and worse still, Jack Sharp managed to find himself a porcupine and try to do battle with it, which did not end well, as you can imagine, for Jack Sharp, whose name was perhaps a little ironic, because he got sharply poked with some porcupine quills that got stuck in his nose, and Simcoe wrote that he was ill for days afterwards, probably pretty upset and more than a little bit injured by that porcupine that he had found. And it wasn't just Jack Sharp. The Simcoes actually had 3 pets while they were living at Niagara. There was Jack Sharp. There was also an anonymous cat, white with gray spots, that Elizabeth Simcoe writes about in her diary. She was, this cat, a gift to the Simcoes. Had grown up in Kingston and now moved out here to Niagara on that frontier. Elizabeth writes in her diary that this cat's sense and attachment are such that those who believe in transmigration, I believe, reincarnation, would think his soul once animated a reasoning being. That this was a particularly intelligent cat who would make the journey with them to Toronto eventually as well. And the cat and Jack Sharp were also joined by another dog. Trojan. He was a hound who was a gift to the kids, to young Frances and Sophia, if I'm remembering her name right, but was really more than anything Elizabeth Simcoe's dog. He'd go into the tent at night and curl up inside Elizabeth's room and really loved her above all others. Trojan, too, was expert at getting into trouble. Elizabeth Simcoe, in her diary, writes about a day where Trojan was left alone in her room and managed to tear her painstakingly drawn map of the entirety of North America to shreds. It was such a big event in their lives that John Graves Simcoe, who, as I mentioned before, was a fan of writing a bit of bad poetry, now and again penned an entire lengthy ode to that day called "Upon the Dog Trojan Tearing the Map of North America," which, when you read it, if you're willing to subject yourself to it, is really less about the dog than it is about the glory of the British Empire, which was very much one of Simcoe's favorite subjects that he worked into everything whenever he could. Trojan, sadly, wouldn't make the trip to Toronto with the family. During the summer, the family moved, at least part-time, I think, into these tents high atop Queenston Heights. A couple of decades later, it's where Isaac Brock would be killed during the War of 1812, and they had this spectacular view of the Niagara River, and I think maybe a bit more of a breeze, which was needed for them, because it was one day in early April that Trojan sadly met his end. It was an incredibly hot April day. Something that might be strangely familiar to us at this particular moment. Like, even by this year's standards, this day was unbelievably hot. Elizabeth Simcoe says that on that day, April 5th, the temperature got all the way up to 44 degrees Celsius. Unbelievably hot. So hot, in fact, that Trojan headed down the slope into the Niagara River to wade in the water and cool himself down and try to escape some of the heat. But Trojan was also acting a little strangely that day, maybe in part because of the incredible heat, and maybe in part because he'd recently suffered an accidental blow to the head that he was still recovering from. And some of the servants, some of the Simcoe's staff, thought that because he was behaving strangely, Trojan must have rabies. He couldn't have had rabies, or he wouldn't have been in the water. He would have been too afraid of it to go into it, but the servants didn't know that at the time. So they shot Trojan. And he died there in Queenston on the Niagara River, and didn't live to make the trip to Toronto. Elizabeth wrote about it in her diary. This is basically all she said. She explained how hot it was, the circumstances of his death, and ended by saying that the servant shot him, which we regret most excessively, before moving on to talking about the dance that she held that night, which to us seems a little callous when you read it. But when you read her whole diary, this is about as emotional as Elizabeth Simcoe gets. I get the impression that she really saw her diary as a record of events, a historical record, more than a personal diary, a record of her own feelings. So that in these few seemingly mundane words, I think there's a wealth of emotion now. In fact, it's in the way she holds it back that you can see maybe a little bit of how much it meant to her. When her daughter, Catherine, dies, I think she doesn't mention it in her diary at all, probably because it was too painful. Things were changing, though. Simcoe had been sent here, as I mentioned before, in part because the British thought another war with the Americans was inevitable. That it was only a matter of time before the Americans invaded Upper Canada, which meant Simcoe spent a lot of his time preparing this colony for war. And that meant that he thought Niagara wasn't exactly the best place to keep his capital. So this is the painting I showed you, Elizabeth Simcoe's work before. It shows you the mouth of the river. And on the left-hand side, we have Navy Hall, where Newark is and where the British government, the capital, was held. But the whole right-hand side of the photo, that's the United States now, just the way it is today. If you head down to Navy Hall, you can hear the Americans on the other side of the river talking to each other on their docks. And this side was heavily fortified. That's Fort Niagara there, an old fort that had been in British hands before the Revolution, which was now in American hands. And it held a dominating position across the river mouth and above the British capital of Upper Canada. So this capital was incredibly vulnerable to American attack. Simcoe knew he couldn't keep it there and that he needed somewhere else to have the capital of Upper Canada. And he found it hidden away toward the background of this painting in this thin sliver of pixels you can see behind Navy Hall. And that's where the city of Toronto now stands, far across on the other side of the lake. So Simcoe figured he could move the capital from down here, just across the little river from the United States, all the way to the other side of the lake, so that at least they'd have to sail across the lake before attacking. They wouldn't have such a dominant position over the British, and Toronto had this natural bay that would be really easy to defend. Back then, the Toronto Islands weren't separate from the mainland. They were still a big long sandbar, a peninsula that was still attached with a bit of land. So that the only way to sail into the harbor was through one thin mouth, where Simcoe figured he would build a fort that would be able to defend his new capital when the Americans inevitably invaded. So they headed off in a ship, the ship I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the HMS Mississauga, far across Lake Ontario to the side where today you'll find the city of Toronto. And that brings us back to Toronto Bay. This is also what it looked like in 1793. A place, as I mentioned, that had been home to the First Nations and their ancestors for as long as anyone could remember, thousands and thousands of years. The Wendat, the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and at the time the Simcoes arrived, the Mississaugas. It was the Mississaugas that the British had signed a treaty with, the Toronto Purchase. It had been signed a few years earlier, and at this point in time, the British hadn't even realized what an enormous fraud it was. Even by British standards, it turned out to be a completely invalid document. A blank deed that didn't even describe the land on it, and the signatures of the First Nations chiefs, the Mississauga chiefs, hadn't been signed on separate pieces of paper and then attached to it later. Simcoe would discover this soon, tell his boss about it, and they decide not to tell the Mississaugas, to wait a few more years until disease and overhunting, overfishing had weakened them, so they'd have less leverage in negotiations, which is when this version of the Toronto Purchase was signed. And still, it would be not until 2010 that a settlement was finally reached over the Toronto Purchase, with a $145 million settlement, the value of the land in 1793. But it was that blank deed that paved the way for Toronto to be built here as far as the British were concerned, which is what leads us back to this painting of the week Toronto was founded. You can see the masts of the ships, one of which the Simcoes had sailed over on, and the tents of the soldiers and of the Simcoes themselves. One of those tents is in fact that canvas house that they brought with them from Niagara. This drawing by C.W. Jeffreys that I showed you before is from the 1900s. He drew many scenes of Canadian history. It's actually incredibly accurate because he's based this drawing on one of Elizabeth Simcoe's own paintings of that exact spot where they pitched their tent and started building Fort York. So you can look at the pattern of those two trees, the canoe by their base, even the shape of the shoreline, all matches very closely Elizabeth Simcoe's painting of the exact same spot. So today, it's near the foot of Bathurst Street. Fort York is still standing on that exact spot today, though the lake has been filled further in south. And it's there that the Simcoes pitched their canvas house, and the first family, the founding family of Toronto, lived again in basically just a tent on the shoreline, far cry from their country estate at home. Simcoe used it, as he had at Niagara, as a base to sort of establish British rule in Upper Canada and in Toronto, pretty specifically. Spent his time sort of establishing British institutions in the city. So one of the first things, as I say, in fact the very first thing he did, was have his men start building Fort York just across the mouth of a little creek from the canvas house. And big old trees, hundreds of years old, started coming crashing to the ground to make room. He would also run the government of Upper Canada out of there for a while. And not at Fort York, which became the big military base to guard the mouth of that harbour, while at the back of the harbour, well guarded, were the Parliament buildings that were built just before Simcoe headed home. They now beside where the distillery district is. They would famously end up being burned down by the Americans during the War of 1812, which is part of why the British burned down the White House in retaliation. And when Simcoe heard of a great victory that the British had won in Europe, far on the other side of the world, in a war against the French, he ordered all the ships in the harbor and all the cannons on the ground, all to fire in celebration of this victory that had been won by a prince known as the Duke of York, the son of the king, I think the uncle maybe of Queen Victoria, who Simcoe decided to rename Toronto, a name that had been sort of in place for what's now Toronto for a long time by then, but which Simcoe replaced with the name York in honor of this victory, in honor of this prince who was just about to get caught up in one of the biggest sex scandals in British history, the horribly disgraced, whose mistress was selling access to him to other men through her, and who it turned out was a pretty lousy military leader after all as well. He might have won that victory, but in general he was seen to be so inept that British school children still recite a little poem about how terrible a military leader he was, which some of you will know about the Duke of York marching his men, his soldiers, his troops up a hill just to march them back down again. That's this guy, the Duke of York, who York, Toronto was named in honor of because of his military prowess. For at least a few years. But just like at Niagara, While Simcoe was settling all the government stuff, Elizabeth was hard at work trying to bring that British drawing room culture to the Canvas House at Toronto as well, an even more remote place than Niagara, since Niagara at least had a tiny little town. At York at the time, there was nothing, just the beginnings of Fort York. A lot of the leading families dragged their feet making the move to the new capital because they didn't want to live this miserable life in tents at the edge of the forest. But they were gradually forced to. Elizabeth Simcoe held dinners and dances and balls and card games here as well. And she wrote in her diary, made paintings, and very interestingly, in my opinion at least, also enjoyed all sorts of freedoms at Toronto that she would never have been able to enjoy back home in England. Here, she did things that would be unthinkable for a British gentlewoman in the late 1700s. She went out riding alone on her horse through the forest, poked rattlesnakes with a stick, ate raccoon meat, went on canoe trips, even, shockingly, became something of a pyromaniac. Elizabeth Simcoe loved setting fires just to watch them burn. She writes about it over and over again in her diary. That she saw a forest fire outside Quebec City that first winter and loved the look of the smoke hanging in the trees so much that she just started setting fire to grass everywhere she found it. Would let her children watch it burn and would enjoy the smoke and enjoyed playing with some more metaphorical fire as well. Elizabeth Simcoe, through these trips in Upper Canada, spent a suspicious amount of time alone with her husband's secretary, Thomas Talbot, his right-hand man, quite literally in this painting, a dashing young soldier who wasn't quite as weak as her older husband, John, and her diary is filled with suspicious little stories about what seem really like romantic little moments when they walk across the frozen ice of the bay. It's Thomas Talbot who takes her by the arm while her husband walks a few strides in front of them. When Simcoe and Talbot meet with First Nations chief, it's Thomas Talbot who brings her back gifts from them. When she's upset by the sight of some passenger pigeons being sold in a market because they're squawking and flapping in their cage, it's Thomas Talbot who pays to have them released so that she won't be upset. Her favorite place was what's now the Toronto Islands, what was back then still that sandbar, where she was even further from sort of British influence. Not only was she all the way over here, so far from London and sort of the center of the empire, she was now even far on the other side of the bay, where not even the eyes of Simcoe's men and the soldiers would see her. This is where she set at least one of those fires, and where she and Thomas Talbot had what again sounds like a pretty romantic time, racing their horses across the sand of the beach together. So the people ever since have wondered whether Elizabeth Simcoe and Thomas Talbot might have had feelings for each other, maybe even had an affair. Elizabeth Simcoe would eventually head home to England, but Thomas Talbot stayed here in what became Ontario. He, in fact, was put in charge of settling a huge swath of southern Ontario, all around London. You'll see his name, Colonel Talbot Road runs through London. But he himself, even though he's incredibly powerful, lived a life of a hermit in a little cabin here on a bluff looking out over Lake Erie. People wondered why he kept to himself throughout his life. When a big famous British author, Anna Jameson, came to Upper Canada, she asked what people thought it was. And the most common story told was that when he was a young man, he'd had his heart broken by some mysterious woman, and he'd never recovered from it. And so historians ever since have wondered whether that might have been Elizabeth Simcoe. But she was also a family woman. She stayed with John for her entire life. And another one of C.W. Jeffreys' drawings sort of shows us the family life at York. That's the canvas house in the background there. They're meeting an Ojibwe chief, Kenice, who's holding their little toddler, Francis, in his arms. Francis, they would give a bit of land, since they were handing it out to all the settlers, and build a log cabin on it that they sort of satirically called Castle, and named in honor of their son, Castle Frank, which is why there's Castle Frank subway station in Toronto today. In fact, this is the day that the cannons were fired off in honor of the Duke of York. And Elizabeth wrote very proudly in her diary that Kenice was very impressed that Francis, even with the loud booming happening all around him, wasn't upset by all that noise. In fact, for his next birthday, this toddler, this tiny little child, would be given a working toy cannon of his own. And you can also see, sort of, evidence of Jack Sharp and the fact that he'd made the journey as well. C.W. Jeffreys seems to have gotten a little confused. So this drawing actually shows Trojan, who was dead by now, instead of Jack Sharp, who's the one who actually made the voyage. But it's a reminder, at least, of the existence of Toronto's founding dog, Jack Sharp, and of the fact that he was there with them. Now, Jack Sharp was far from the first canine ever to set paw on the land where Toronto now stands. The forests of Toronto have been home to foxes and wolves for many, many thousands of years by the time Toronto was founded. The foxes, of course, you will still find there today. The wolves, not so much. And there have been domesticated dogs too. Local First Nations had hunting dogs, pets, with them just as long as anyone could remember. They played an incredibly important part of their life. A Wendat historian, George Seaweed, who has a wonderful book about the history of the Wendat, writes that Wendat souls were thought to travel along the Milky Way into the afterlife, and their dogs would travel beside them on sort of a parallel route through the stars, a celestial dog path to be with their masters in the afterlife. So, humans have been having very close relationships with dogs in Toronto long before the city was founded. Jack Sharp, at least, is the modern city's founding dog, who lived here in the canvas tent, the canvas house with the Simcoes. That cat had made the journey too. Elizabeth Simcoe writes about the Toronto's founding feline in her diary at Toronto, amazed by the cat's bravery, who had been very brave on the ship across Lake Ontario, and who kept guard at Elizabeth Simcoe's door of the canvas tent, wasn't distressed by all the banging away as they chopped down trees and built Fort York. She said it was as brave as any dog. I love the fact that Toronto's founding cat seems to have been a bit of a badass. And Jack Sharp, as I say, was there too, and played a similar role as he had at Niagara, heading out with Simcoe on his travels through the wilderness. And one in particular. You can imagine his life at Toronto, playing in the shallow water of the lake, running around with those Simcoe children who are now a little older, able to play with their pets, chasing, I imagine, raccoons and squirrels and chipmunks through the woods. But his life at Toronto would be complicated by the thing that had complicated their lives the entire time they were here, which was the threat of war. In fact, it nearly ended Jack Sharp's life. The British were right, and Simcoe was right. The Americans were going to invade eventually. This is an image from the Battle of York, the American invasion of Toronto during the War of 1812. And Simcoe was hard at work preparing for this. One of the things he was doing was building new roads that were more than anything going to serve a military purpose. And Jack Sharp would turn out to help with that. The first big road was sent out west from Toronto, out in the direction of London. Simcoe would name it after his boss, a man who would also be involved in delaying the abolition of slavery across the British Empire, which is why soon in Toronto we will no longer be calling this Dundas Street. But it wouldn't be the only big thoroughfare carved through the forest as a way of armies moving fast through the wilderness. Simcoe also wanted to build one north, in this direction, toward the banks of Lake Simcoe in particular. So Simcoe headed out with a bunch of his men and some Ojibwe guides to travel along the Toronto Carrying Place Trail. It was a portage route that had been there as long as anyone could remember, heading sort of two forks of it, one up the Rouge River, but the main one up the Humber River, all the way up to the top of the river to reach Holland Marsh, and with a bit of more of a portage, what's now Lake Simcoe beyond, from where they could then reach Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, all the upper Great Lakes, which made the Toronto portage route, the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, a huge shortcut through the middle of the continent. You could easily get from the St. Lawrence, Lake Ontario, all the way to the middle of the continent, not be far from the Mississippi, all thanks to this portage route. And as Simcoe and his men and his Ojibwe guides moved up the portage route, Jack Sharp was there with them to give them some muscle, help protect them against any wolves or any bears they might come across. Simcoe admitted that the big dog was not entirely graceful when you put him in a canoe, but seemed happy to have him there anyway, as they spent 4 days traveling up the Humber all the way up toward the lake that was their destination. It had been called many things over the years. The Wendat called it Wentorong, which meant beautiful, or means beautiful water. The French had started calling it Lac Toronto long before Toronto was founded. An indigenous, I think Haudenosaunee word, am I getting that right? That referred to the fishing weirs they had in Lake Simcoe, poles in the water. So it's where there are trees standing in the water. And how Toronto got its name, because Lake Toronto gave its name to the Toronto Carrying Place Trail that ended there and was eventually used to refer to the place that started as well. And when Simcoe showed up, it was called Lac aux Clés, which is also a French word referring to those fishing weirs. Simcoe decided to name it after his own father instead, which is how it became known as Lake Simcoe. His dad had died of illness while fighting the French, trying to conquer New France, not long before the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And then they had to start the journey home, which went a lot worse than the journey up had. Some early omens might have been when Simcoe went to go visit a friend of his, or an ally of his, Kanice, that same Ojibwe chief who's holding Francis Simcoe in that drawing I showed you. And when he got to his village, he found that Kanice had died, and his eldest son had died too. It's easy to imagine that it might have been of the diseases that were now tearing through indigenous communities at apocalyptic rates. And Simcoe himself would soon be in danger of dying on this trip too. Things got off to a pretty rough start on the way back, and soon got worse than that. Simcoe would eventually build Yonge Street up toward Lake Simcoe to fulfill the same function as that old portage route. But Yonge Street didn't exist yet, so Simcoe couldn't use it, and started running into quite a lot of bad luck. His group ran into trouble. One man seriously injured his toe so badly he couldn't walk. They were forced to separate into two groups. Seems like a lot of the Ojibwe guys went with the other group instead of Simcoe's group. Simcoe's group was left with only 1 day worth of food, 1 day of rations, but a 5-day walk ahead of them. They stumbled through the eastern fork of the trail, not the way they'd come down, but tried to go the Rouge River way instead. It was on the very eastern border of Toronto, and they got lost. They were stumbling through the woods day after day, running out of food with almost none left at all, seriously worrying that they were about to starve to death in the forests of Upper Canada with no food left at all. Which is when Simcoe and his men made a grisly plan. They decided that if they didn't find their way, if they couldn't figure out where they were, find some landmark they recognized by the end of that day, well, then they were only going to have one option left. Their eyes turned to the only readily available source of meat they had, which was Jack Sharp. Jack Sharp, of course, could not have known how lucky he was that Simcoe and his men stumbled across a surveyor's line and then came out of the trees to see the familiar sight of Lake Ontario, just east a few kilometers of the town. So Jack Sharp's life was spared. Simcoe and his men scarfed down all the rest of their food for breakfast and then hurried home to York, where Simcoe's family was waiting for him. Elizabeth, the kids, and the cat there to welcome Simcoe and Jack Sharp home from what must have been Jack Sharp's most harrowing journey of all. Now, the Simcoes didn't stay in the Canadian colonies for very long. They were only here for, I think, about 5 years or so before they headed off home to England. And as far as I've ever seen, there's no evidence of what happened to Jack Sharp or to that brave little cat in the time after the Simcoes left. They just vanish into history as the Simcoes and their 2 surviving children loaded all their stuff, including, presumably, that spinning wheel, back into their ship and headed off home to England. They'd spend the rest of their lives living at Wolford Lodge at their estate. For John Graves Simcoe, that wouldn't be very long at all. He died during the War of 1812, fighting on Napoleon, actually, in Europe. He was poisoned by paint fumes, fresh paint, on a ship that gave him a horrible asthmatic attack as he was sailing from England to Lisbon. But Elizabeth Simcoe, she would stay at Wolford for the rest of her life. In age, it fades originally, it's less shocking to go straight to her, but she lived, I think, well into her 80s, watched her husband and most of her children die before she too finally passed away and was buried at a little chapel on their land that they had built there. Wolford Chapel is actually still there today. You can go visit the Simcoes and some of their children buried beneath it in the English countryside. And if you do, you'll find this Canadian flag and Ontario heritage plaque right outside it, because this land in the middle of Devon is officially part of Canadian territory. It's actually officially part of Ontario, given to the people of Ontario by the people of England so that the Simcoes rest forever in Canadian soil. And you can go visit a little piece of Canada in the middle of the beautiful English countryside. As for the town they left behind, well, it grew a lot after them. Thousands, tens of thousands, eventually millions of people would call that muddy little town of York home. It would eventually get its indigenous name back too and become the city of Toronto. A city founded in some small part at least, with the help of Jack Sharp, the big Newfoundland dog. If you want to find one of the last surviving pieces of him that's remembered, well, then the best place to look is in Bradford. It's there that you'll find a monument to Elizabeth Simcoe. I took this photo earlier today. Mark was generous enough to let me hop out of the truck and grab a few shots. Because just after getting picked up at the GO station. And you'll find all sorts of details in this monument that reflect what we've been talking about tonight. She's holding in her arms some of her work, some of her paintings, it seems, some of the flora of Upper Canada. You'll find around the other side the canvas house with one of those dances, one of those balls being held inside it. Below that, you'll find Knies, it seems, holding Francis Simcoe, just like he is in that drawing. And just to the side, and below them, you'll find what should be Jack Sharp, but seems instead to be Trojan. So, the wrong dog, but still a reminder of the fact that Jack Sharp was here in his place as Toronto's founding dog. So, that brings me to the end of the talk. Very quickly, if you're interested in more of my work, I've got a couple of books, the Toronto Book of Love, the Toronto Book of the Dead, as Mark mentioned, and have a weekly newsletter where I share stories about Toronto history, the Toronto History Weekly, a documentary series all about Canadian history. Our most recent episode is actually all about Newfoundland dogs. It's all free to watch on YouTube. I also do online courses. The upcoming one, not sure what it's got all weird, but it's all about, it's called A Very Frustrating History of Getting Around Toronto, from shipwrecks and stagecoaches to traffic jams. And you can find it all on my website, which is just adammunch.com, where there are links to all of the various things I do. So that's the only thing you have to remember. I also have bookmarks if you want any, if you are worried about having to remember my name. So thank you all so much for being here and for your patience as I rambled on about those stories. I'm so excited to have been able to share them with you tonight.